Welcome to Ponchatoula Live, the show where we make it easy for you to connect with the people of Ponchatoula. I'm your host, Parker Layrisson, and I've got a fantastic guest today. Today's guest is one of my heroes. He's really one of the heroes of Ponchatoula, in part because he's an accomplished educator who's helped so many folks get through this town and learn a thing or two, in part because he's a community servant who has dedicated countless hours to making our community a better place through organizations like Kiwanis, and in part because he is our town historian. He is the reason we know what Ponchatoula was like in the good old days, and he's also just a great all-around guy. So with no further ado, I bring to you Mr. Jim Perrin. Mr. Jim, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing very well.
Why don't we kick off by you just telling us a little bit about yourself, please?
Well, I'm a Ponchatoula native. Actually, I was born in Hammond because that's where Wigington Infirmary was, but I've lived in Ponchatoula most of my life, and I just enjoy saying these words. I am from Ponchatoula.
Amen.
I'm so proud of our community.
I love that. You know, it reminds me of a little story. My dad, and I can't do this story justice, so I have to call my dad to get him on the show, but he tells a story of as a little kid, he was off in a faraway place, Mexico maybe, and somebody asked him, where he was from, and long story short, the guy knew where Ponchatoula was, but my dad had said he was from New Orleans, and he felt so bad because he said New Orleans, thinking the guy wouldn't know. And he's like, oh, I know a little place right up the road from New Orleans where they sell strawberries. It's Ponchatoula. It's this great place. So he said at a young age, he decided he would never again say he was from New Orleans or Hammond or anywhere nearby. It was from Ponchatoula. So it's neat to hear you say that. You are, of course, the author of the book on Ponchatoula, Louisiana, A Community History. This is, I believe, your second book on the city. Is that right?
That's correct. First one.
What piqued your interest in the history of our little town? How'd you get started in that area?
Well, if you live in a community for a long time, you get interested in it, interested in the people, all the people work together. And historically, Ponchatoula has been a tight-knit community. A lot of the families that are intermarried with each other, and so there's a lot of family connections, community connections, and I've always been curious about why things happen, not just when they happen, but why things happen. There's always a reason that things happen.
So I guess as a historian, and I know that you research public records, you're reading everything you can, getting old photos, you're allowed to kind of pull at that thread a bit and figure out the why behind the when and the what and the who and all that, right? Has that been an interesting part of your career as a historian?
Absolutely.
What have been some things you've discovered that may have surprised you as you were kind of in your search for the why?
Well, there's been a lot of little things. For example, everybody in the community is probably familiar with Gabriel's Building and Supply Company.
Of course, more so this last 3 weeks than most times, but yeah, of course.
Correct. And then when you exit that facility, it's sometimes hard to turn left because there's a curve right there.
Yeah, the main street's not a straight angle. Right, good point.
But the main street runs in a straight direction for couple miles, but all of a sudden there's a curve there. Why is there a curve there? And the reason is that was the edge of town, and James B. Clark that laid out Ponchatoula, that was the end of his property. And the town wasn't really laid out north, south, east, west, and the road doesn't really run exactly to the west. And if it continued at the same angle, it would run into the swamp pretty soon. So it had to turn, and that's where the curve is. Right there by Gabriel's.
So his property wasn't, the grid wasn't really set up on the directional boundaries, and they had to adjust to get kind of back on track there with what's now Highway 22. Is that right?
That's correct. The town was laid out as the railroad track was, and the railroad track doesn't exactly run exactly north-south. Clark, when he laid out the town, he made a map. I'm going to hold it up. I'm not sure.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, we can see that well. Yeah, please do share that. That's neat.
He went to New Orleans and had this map made in 1853. It's a lithographed map. The original is in the Collinswood Museum. But he had to decide when he laid out the town, would he make his squares run with the railroad track or make the squares exactly north-south. If he made the squares exactly north-south, it would mess up his plan for having orderly squares. So we have the squares correspond with the angle of the railroad track. And we have city blocks that are 400 feet long and 400 feet wide until you get to the edge of his property. And then you don't have complete blocks. At that point, you have fractional blocks. So that's the reason there's the curve there.
So it looks like on your map, he's even got the lots drawn out within the squares. And then some squares appear to be blank. Were those green spaces designed to be parks, or what was the purpose there?
When he laid out the town, he reserved 4 square blocks, one in each quarter of the town, for public use. And one is Kiwanis Park, one is Memorial Park, one is where the athletic facility is for the Ponchatoula Athletics that played in that park for many years, and the other park is where the public school is. At least all the public schools on that square. And then he also reserved a square in the center of town for his employer, the railroad company, the New Orleans Jackson and Great Northern Railroad Company.
Okay. So when you were a child, were you interested in history kind of coming up? Because, you know, we started this interview with mention, I think it was Wigington Infirmary where you were born, right? And then, you know, your history soon after that, those what I'll call humble Hammond beginnings, you moved to the Green Acres of Ponchatoula. You mentioned families, right? And the Perrin, I may be the biggest family in town. I mean, I know I live near the Perrin elementary school, and you know, there seems to be more Perrins than any. But when did you develop this? I'm just kind of curious in your personal history. When did the inspiration, you know, an interest in history develop?
Well, probably not one particular date, but for example, when I would find an Indian relic, an arrowhead.
Oh, that's cool.
I would pick this up from the ground and think about, I'm the first person that touched this relic in 500 years, perhaps 1,000 years. And you reflect on the person that made this projectile point. How did they live? Most of the evidence that they had ever lived has passed away. But there are arrowheads, projectile points, pottery shards, and other rock-like elements that remain. Things like that, and finding old documents, old pictures, old letters, it just sparked my curiosity.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad it did, because, you know, bringing your book back into the picture, you know, the first thing I do when I get in there is notice that you have this old picture of the office we're sitting in now from, you know, roughly 100 years ago, in a history of the folks, not only the Rayford family who I bought the property from, but the Roussells who owned it for, you know, half century before them. Your book is just packed with things like that. I mean, unfortunately, no arrowheads in there, but these photos of old baseball teams, Ponchatoula Athletics, old school buildings, you know, hotels, etc. We're so lucky you put all that together. Before we dig into the book itself, the contents, more history of Ponchatoula, why don't you educate our viewers a little bit on your personal history? You know, what was life like growing up in the Perrin family here in Ponchatoula during your childhood?
Well, I grew up on the east side of Ponchatoula, and my only connection early in Hammond was going to the hospital and being born there. I lived in Ponchatoula as a youth until we moved to Shreveport for a few years, and then we moved back in 1957. But I had a very nice family life. I have one sister and one brother who's now deceased. And my father was a carpenter, and he, not unusual for a Perrin. There are many Perrin carpenters in this community.
Yeah, right.
But the Perrins came to this area in 1870, but some of my other families have been here since about 1800. The Mitchells and the Levines and the Hoovers and the Poches and many other families are interrelated, mostly on the east side between what is now Ponchatoula and the Tangipahoa River, although Ponchatoula wasn't here at that time, of course.
Right.
not 1800.
Wow. So that
You mentioned a picture of your office. That was a postcard. That image was taken from a postcard. Every
yes,
now
sir.
and then, companies would come through town and they would ask who wants an image made of your house or your business, and they would make postcards for a nominal fee. And that's where that image came from. And again, it is in the 1920s. I'm not sure of the
I
exact.
appreciate you mentioning that. You told me that before, and I was actually able to get a copy of one. So I've got it in plastic here, but I keep it here in the office. That's so neat. And I just love that photo with that old car in front of what was then a residence, but it says Residence Scene, Ponchatoula, Louisiana, there on the front. That's so neat. Well, tell me about who the important people in your life were growing up. You mentioned siblings, your parents, your father's a carpenter. Who were your friends that you ran with, schoolmates? Just, when you think back to the good old days as a child in Ponchatoula, who comes to mind?
Um, Glenn Barnes was a neighbor and a good friend. He lived across the street. When I was a child, there weren't very many people around. It was kind of an isolated area, so there weren't a lot of other children nearby. And then I would go to school and meet people. My first teacher in the first grade, they didn't have kindergarten in Ponchatoula at the time, was Miss Ida Pusey, whose husband was Sam Pusey, that many people in Ponchatoula remember. And Miss Ida was a great first grade teacher.
Well, speaking of education, I'm sorry, please could go on. Please do.
You mentioned the photograph of your office.
Yes,
One
sir.
of the things that I like about photographs, and I just brought two with me. This is a photograph, the first photograph of Ponchatoula. It's an image of the Ponchatoula Depot. And this
Oh,
was
wow.
taken probably in 1853 or 1854. The depot was built at that time. And I don't know if the viewers can see it, but it's a small little building, and it was closer to Pine Street than the present train depot is. There's a picture of a couple of people, one sitting on top of a flat car. And in
So
the
that's a
back,
flat rail car that he's on?
right, a very small
Okay.
car. And in the background, you can't see much of anything except pine trees. And that's about all there was in Ponchatoula. They had the depot, and then after a while, the business corners near the railroad track were cleared. But most of Ponchatoula remained forested for quite some time. When I get a photograph, this one or any other photograph, one of the things I do is look at it intensely to see what's in the background, and see if I can get a magnifying glass and pick out any details from that picture. And I'll show you the other photograph.
Yeah, please do.
This is a much later photograph of Ponchatoula. This is about 1910, and it shows the depot. This is not the same building because that depot was burned during the Civil War. But this depot was, again, much closer to Pine Street than the present depot. And in the background was the Beagle Hotel on the west side of the railroad tracks. And on the corner, the Campbell Building, which is still there.
Yeah, that's recognizable. Yeah, on the west side.
That building was built in 1904 by Joseph F. Campbell. And for many years, the corner was a tavern, a bar room. And then later, it was the corner drugstore. And then many people remember it as the Caruth drugstore.
Caruth drugstore, right. Was it
later the Vineyard drugstore?
Okay.
And now there's a cafe in that corner.
It's so neat to see, that's clearly the horse and buggy era that you're showing us, and to see a building. I mean, you can, it's a little different now. There's a deck out front instead of, an awning like that, but you can recognize that building easily. And to think that today you might have a Tesla parked out front that runs on electricity, and in your photo it's horse and buggy, and it went through all these iterations you mentioned, all the different businesses. That's so cool. What's that big building behind it? Looks like a 2-story, maybe a hotel or something, or maybe a 3-story building.
It's two and a half stories. It was the Beagle Hotel. It was built about 1893, and it really wasn't a very successful business because Mr. Beagle, who owned it, was sued quite a few times for various debts he owed people. The good news about being sued was that it produced lots of records which described the building and how
Yeah.
many rooms it had and how much furniture and so on. So sometimes even bad news like being sued can have some good
Right.
results for the future.
Wow, that's cool. Thank you for sharing those photos. That's really neat. Um, so obviously this is a labor of love. I mean, I would imagine you're not getting rich as a bestseller author for a book like Ponchatoula's history. Is that right? Can you tell folks what the process is like to be an author? I mean, this latest book is 300 pages, and they're big pages. We're not talking about some small book. This is 8.5 by 11 or something similar. What kind of time goes into something like this, and how do you go about writing a book, the type of books you've written?
Well, I suppose I worked slow because it took many years to get the material, but it is a labor of love. It's something I enjoy doing. And to get the information, I started locally at the city hall and then went to AMEAD and spent countless days going through the records, the deed records, the marriage records, the civil suits, the wills and probate records. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but there's a lot of records. And for example, in the civil suits, they're indexed, but you really can't tell very much from the index. So I went through probably 5,000 of the civil suits looking for civil suits that contained information about Ponchatoula. So that was a time-consuming effort, but it was worth it. And then further afield, there are records at the archives in Baton Rouge that I accessed, and records concerning Ponchatoula and Jackson, Mississippi, concerning the Civil War operations around Ponchatoula, records at Tulane University.
Oh wow! So you actually had to leave the state to go into some archives to get more Ponchatoula info. That part's surprising to me.
Yes, I had several trips to the National Archives in Washington and the Cartographic Library of the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. I went to Chicago because that's where the Illinois Central records are kept. That's the railroad that went through Ponchatoula for generations. So it took quite a while and a lot of effort, but again, that's what I like to do. And one of the things was reading microfilm. And microfilm's kind of gone out of usage now since so many things are digitized. But in the old days,
yeah, some of our younger viewers may not get what that was. Now, I remember well in my days at Ponchatoula High in the '90s, we had great librarians, Miss Neal, Miss Harper, and they still had the microfilm in full effect and taught us how to use it. But would you mind describing what that actually is for the millennials and other folks that may not have ever seen microfilm?
Well, census records and a number of other records came on microfilm in a spool, and you would put the spool on the machine and it would show the image from the documents that had been filmed on the microfilm. And I bought my own microfilm reader and got the microfilm on loan from the National Archives or other sources, and it was cranking image to image. So
that's old school. That's great.
Took a while to do that. And some of the things that were on microfilm were also newspaper records. And newspaper records are excellent sources. This is a New Orleans newspaper from 1849. This is an original copy, but they're also on microfilm. Today, of course, they're digitized, and they have subscription services that are available for a fee, and you can access a lot of old newspapers. Sometimes I would go through the Ponchatoula Enterprise, which was the paper of record in Ponchatoula from 1921 until it suspended operations several years ago. And the people who had the newspaper were generous enough to let me borrow the books. And I would go through the newspapers page by page and abstract any articles that were of historical interest. So that was a way to accumulate some information. And I mentioned the civil suits a moment ago from AMEAD. In one of the civil suits, I found a copy of a Ponchatoula newspaper, and this is a photocopy of that newspaper. This is 1914, It's the only edition of this newspaper that exists. And so we copied this newspaper. There's a copy in the Collinswood Museum. But this is a Ponchatoula newspaper from before the Enterprise started in 1921.
The Ponchatoula Democrat was. We have that. You know, that's 100 years ago, roughly. Then we have the Enterprise for the better part of a century, as you mentioned, and then the Ponchatoula Times, I think, is founded in when, the 70s, give or take, or 80s, or
been in publication for 40 some years.
40 plus years, and it's now the only paper standing. Are there any other newspapers that have been out there during this time?
They had the Ponchatoula News Herald, which was issued by Nicholas Murray for a number of years.
Okay.
We had a syndicate of several newspapers, one in Ponchatoula, Hammond, and so on in other parts of the parish also. And they had other Ponchatoula newspapers, but people don't usually keep newspapers. They're thrown away very quickly.
Right.
So the earlier Ponchatoula newspapers exist only here and there. And so when I find something like that, I get excited. Of course, I get excited about kind of weird things. But
I could see your eyes kind of light up there when you thought about it, finding a new newspaper from Ponchatoula. But I guess that makes sense. You know, the court records, you know, the clerk of court has certain responsibilities to keep records for a very long time. And I guess we lawyers leave a trail when we file suit against folks civilly, and that allows you to find some breadcrumbs of what happened historically. But you're right, a newspaper, if it's not kept in a book or on microfilm or elsewhere, you know, you're right, they're tossed in the trash daily. So I guess that trail goes cold a lot quicker. In addition to newspapers, court records, you've shown these photographs. You know, where else do you find things? And in part, where do you find the photographs? Because your book's chock full of them. I mean, great sports photographs of the Ponchatoula Athletics, who you mentioned. You know, all this stuff. Where do you go for your sources?
Well, as far as photographs, the biggest collection that I was able to access was from the late Judge Leon Ford, who was quite interested in history, and he had a Ponchatoula heritage through the Butler family here in Ponchatoula. And he loaned me quite a number of images. And so I copied the ones of interest concerning Ponchatoula for my collection, and also made a copy of those for the Collinswood Museum. So that was the biggest source, but there's several other people in Ponchatoula that would loan me images. And then I would find images online on eBay, for example. They have postcards from Ponchatoula from time to time. And they also had currency that was issued in Ponchatoula.
Wait, Tula bucks? There was currency from here? Tell us about that. How'd that happen?
Well, when the Civil War started, the coinage disappeared. The copper and silver coins disappeared. So to have something to circulate, the town of Ponchatoula printed its own currency. 25-cent notes, 50-cent notes. And those are quite rare. And they were advertised on eBay, and they had images of them. I think they sold for $200 or $300 a piece. I didn't buy them. That was a little above my price range. But the image.
You got to sell a lot of books to buy a $200 item.
I don't have any of those. But the image was there, and I could make a copy of the image. And,
yeah.
But
that's so cool.
Very generous. Many people over the years have been very generous with information and images. And I hesitate to start naming some of them because I know I'll forget.
Of course, I mean, it would be impossible not to leave people out. But in general, so it sounds like, and this is kind of rings true to the theme of this show. It sounds like it takes a village here, and it's the generosity and the spirit of the people of Ponchatoula that kind of make your work possible. I mean, as I look down at your book and thumb through 300 pages, I'm overwhelmed with gratitude that this little town of roughly 7,000 people, according to our official population, has a resource like that, right? I mean, it's just amazing. And my first thought is thank God for Jim Perrin, because if not for this one man, this never happens. You know, quite frankly, the rest of us are too lazy to go to the National Archives or even the AMET Clerk of Court. But what you're telling me is Yeah, that's part of it, but it takes a village. Many families have shared with you their own personal collections, and you've been able to kind of put that to use. Is that right?
Right. Thank you for those kind words. But other people have been kind to me. Uh,
Yeah.
the city officials, Collins Bonacorn, Julian Dufresh, and Bob Zabia, all have been very forthcoming with information from the city.
Right. As I recall, Julian Dufresh had a great photo collection. Did he share that with you, or maybe he got his copies from you? But I know he shared some great old baseball photos with me, and he and his brother Danny. They seem to have a lot of old Ponchatoula memorabilia.
They, they do, they did, and Danny does. And the map that I first referenced to you, this map from 1853, Mayor Julian Dufresh had a friend in New Orleans that found the original map. And Mayor Dufresh's friend got it to him, and he donated it to the Collinswood Museum. So that's where the original map came from.
Wow.
Through Mayor Dufresh. And
would you mind, Mr. Jim, Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were done. Please finish. My bad.
So just to reiterate, a lot of people have helped over the years. And I don't think I could have done that book without assistance from a number of people.
Would you mind? You've mentioned the Collinswood Museum a few times, and I think it's real easy to drive by and not even know it's there. Would you mind sharing with our viewers what that is and kind of what's in there? Just tell us a little about the museum.
Sure. Mr. Herman Collins and his wife had a farm, a very large farm by the Ponchatoula River. They had one child, a little boy, and Mrs. Collins had experience as a school teacher. So they had the wherewithal to build a small building for a school. Now, Mrs. Collins could have taught her son in her home, but she wanted her son to have a school environment, and she wanted to benefit the other children in the neighborhood. So this small little building became a school for children in the Collinswood area. And that whole little area became known as the Collinswood community after the Collins family. And after a number of years, her son left and went on to higher education. But the school continued, and it became a public school after a time and remained a public school for many years. Later, when school bus transportation was available, that school was closed and the students were bused into the town of Ponchatoula. The building was not used as a school for many years. It remained vacant, and then for a time it was used as a storage building and an apartment for a time. Then in 1976, the LaRue family arranged with the city of Ponchatoula to have the building transported into Ponchatoula, and the building was placed on a lot on the corner of Railroad Avenue and East Pine Street. Previous to the museum coming there, that had been the Pearson and Butler store and later the Edwards store. And the Edwards family was very generous and allowed that vacant lot, which was vacant after the Edwards building was torn down, the Edwards store. They allowed that lot to be used as a site as long as it was used for public purposes as a museum. So the Collinswood Museum was established in Ponchatoula in 1976 as a bicentennial project. And the museum is open every day except major holidays. And there's an enormous amount of artifacts and documents in the museum. The main collections center around the strawberry industry, the lumbering industry, railroading, and Native Americans, indigenous people, or Indians as we commonly call them. But you might find just about anything in there when you go in. There's a lot of other things in the museum. The thing that we don't have a whole lot of is space. It's a small building, and we have it pretty full of artifacts.
Yeah, you guys, you make do with a small space, but you packed a lot of neat things in there, and it's been neat to see that little park around it take shape. You know, with the USS Ponchatoula, What can you tell us about that? Because I know that's not in the museum, but it seems like the same kind of grounds or campus, if you will, and both are such historically inclined. What can you tell us about the USS Ponchatoula and that exhibit there?
Well, the USS Ponchatoula Memorial was part of the museum. It's a museum property, and we are very proud to have it there. During World War II, the nation needed scrap metal. We needed iron, we needed aluminum, and other metals. So there were several scrap drives, not just in Ponchatoula, but around the country. But the school children in Ponchatoula collected a vast amount of iron and steel. And it was taken to the school grounds, and they started a small pile, and it grew bigger and bigger, and eventually got to be a vast pile. One of the reasons they were able to collect so much iron and steel was, in the old days, people didn't throw things away. If they had a piece of farm machinery, they put it aside, and they might have gotten a part from it. The motto during the Depression was fix it, mend it, or do without. It was not a disposable economy, so when something broke, they kept it for a while, hoping to have some use for it. But Ponchatoula collected so much material, scrap material, during those scrap drives in 1942 and 1943, that the War Department, working through the Navy Department, decided to honor the town of Ponchatoula and the community by naming a ship the USS Ponchatoula. And a oiler, a tanker, was named for the town, the USS Ponchatoula. Tankers are named for streams, and the stream nearby was also called Ponchatoula, which was very convenient. So they named this ship that was launched during World War II the USS Ponchatoula. It was a small tanker. It served during World War II in the Pacific and saw action in the latter part of World War II around Okinawa and Iwo Jima in those waters.
Wow.
After World War II, the Navy didn't need all the ships, so they scrapped quite a number of ships, and the USS Ponchatoula was scrapped. But the Navy Department thought that Ponchatoula hadn't been honored enough for its efforts during World War II. So in 1955, a new, much larger USS Ponchatoula was launched. And this was kind of a super tanker of its day, a very large ship, more than 400 feet long. And the USS Ponchatoula served mostly in the Pacific, and it served in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It served during the Vietnam War off the coast of North and South Vietnam. After its service life was ended, it served in the merchant service as a contract vessel for the Navy, and later it was retired. It was decided that the USS Ponchatoula would be scrapped. So it was taken from the west coast of the United States, brought through the Panama Canal up to Brownsville, Texas, and cut up for scrap metal, kind of where the USS Ponchatoula started, with a pile of scrap. But before the ship was scrapped, the shipmates of the USS Ponchatoula got together, and they were able to salvage on their own dime a lot of artifacts from the ship and pieces of the structure of the ship. And some of the small artifacts are in the Collinswood Museum, and some of the structural pieces of the stern, the back of the ship, were made into a 1/7 replica of the stern of the USS Ponchatoula. And that's what's in the courtyard. And recently, one of the anchors of the USS Ponchatoula, the last USS Ponchatoula, was located, and the shipmates were able to acquire it, and it is now on display in the courtyard of the Collinswood Museum. It's a large anchor. It's about 9,000 pounds, not counting the chain. So yeah. I don't think the hurricane's going to blow that very far.
So that's the one place you can tie off in Ponchatoula and feel like you're in good shape. You're going to stay put. You can anchor down.
Yes.
That's such a great story, and the irony that this ship that, kind of arose out of a scrap metal donation became scrap twice. It's a neat story. But did I hear in there it's at what the lawyer brain in me heard what I thought was a loophole, whereby this type of ship was typically named for streams, and because we have Ponchatoula Creek, it's able to be USS Ponchatoula, which we think is named for the town, but maybe really is technically named for the stream. Is that how that worked? I guess my question being, if there were no Ponchatoula Creek, does that mean there could be no USS Ponchatoula? What's the rub there?
It probably would have been a different type of vessel.
Okay.
It's named for the stream, but it's named in honor of the town, the
Gotcha.
children that collected the scrap, and all the citizens that helped. And the memorial is a memorial to the ship, but more importantly to the men who served aboard her. I don't think the
of course,
but the men who served aboard the USS Ponchatoula, both of them, and the community that brought the ship into being.
That's such a great story. That's so neat. We've got a question here, a comment I'll post. Mary Newman, and Miss Mary, thank you for tuning in, watching the show. I know Mr. Perrin appreciates that, and I do too. Mary asked where she can get the book and how much. Is your book still for sale in places like Heavenly Gifts and other stores, or have you run out of copies? What's the answer to that question, Mr. Perrin?
There are a few copies left. I think the Country Market has a few. ABA Collectibles on West Pine Street has some. CJ,
okay.
Mary has some over there. So there's a few copies left that are just about sold out, and they retail for $30 per copy.
Get them while you can. So you heard those locations, $30. And this is just kind of a neat, this is how Ponchatoula works sometimes. I remember a rainy day, not unlike today. I saw you at Bonin Supermarket, Mr. Perrin, knowing you were working on your book. I asked you about the status, and you said, well, as it turns out, I just finished and I just got my first shipment of books in, and you sold me some copies there in the parking lot. We walked out to your truck in the Bonin's parking lot, and that's where I got this copy I showed you earlier. So it's kind of neat to have a small town book there where you can just kind of see a guy out and about town and buy a book or go to 3 or 4 shops.
You bought the first copies.
Oh, wow. That's what an honor. That's so cool to, well, of course, I'm going to insist that I get you to sign this copy while you're here. That's because I think we were too busy in a rainy parking lot that day, but I would be honored if you'd sign it. Well, Miss Mary says thank you, and Miss Mary, thank you. Tell us a little more about your journey through Ponchatoula, Mr. Perrin, if you will. We mentioned your childhood, your family, your friends, your educators. You, of course, went on to become a quite legendary educator. You mentioned the Vineyard family at some point earlier, I think, or maybe they just came to my mind, but you were the principal at Vineyard. Tell us about your career in education and what that was like, and maybe some people that were involved, with you in that.
Well, I started teaching at D.C. Reeves Elementary on Sisters
Mm-hmm.
Road, and I taught also at Vineyard Elementary on Dunson Road, which is not really Dunson Road; it's Dunsing Road.
We've been saying it wrong all these years.
Edward Dunsing had a house near the school, and the road was named for him. His name wasn't Dunson; Dunsing, Duensing. But at any rate, I taught at D.C. Reeves for a number of years, and Vineyard for 1 year, and I was interim principal at Woodland Park for 1 year before I got an appointment to serve as the principal of the Martha Vineyard School, and that was in 1982, and I served there for 20 years and retired in 2002 after 34 years of service. And I also was able to get some additional degrees, and a second degree in history, a BA and an MA degree in history. And I taught part-time at Southeastern for 13 years, from 1987 to 2001, when I retired from Southeastern service.
Oh, wow. What a storied career. And I know you impacted so many people along the way. I've people that have been close to me in my life. One of my, quote, second mamas growing up, Miss Sandra Johnson, Sandra Perrin, before that, taught under you. Danny Williams, that I now have the great honor to work with and was my mentor through the Key Club, got his start with you, and then, of course, went on to be a principal. There's so many great educators that you've impacted I just want to thank you for that service. I never got to be your student, but I did, try to pay a little attention. I remember when I was working under Mr. Danny in the Key Club, and of course you were one of the Kiwanians. You were just always somebody we looked to who set an example and really made your mark. So thank you for that service. That school is important to me because my kind of adoptive pawpaw, if you will. Grandpa was Wink Vineyards, who was principal out there too, and all folks like Mr. Reggie Peavy. I mean, that's such a storied campus, and there's so many folks like you that have come through there and made your mark. And I just want to thank you. That's so important.
I was honored to have a very strong faculty, and also the parents were so supportive during that entire 20-year period. And it's such a pleasure to work with children.
It's a great school. We used to do a tutoring program there. I had so many fun days at that school, even though I didn't get to attend it. Speaking of great educators, Miss Margaret Joyner of the Albany school system, but of course of Ponchatoula history, our recent guest on the show, she has piped in here to say what a treasure of knowledge Mr. Perrin is. And of course, Miss Margaret, I agree. Miss Margaret, you and your family are certainly in our prayers right now. We all miss Mr. Sonny. Speaking of Ponchatoula legends, wow, Sonny Joyner doesn't get any bigger contribution to our little town than him and his sons, Shannon and Stormy, and just a great family. And I know this must be a really difficult time for you, Miss Margaret. Just know that we love you and we care about you, and we're praying for you. Viewers, if you're just beginning to watch, we're here with Mr. Jim Perrin, the author of the Ponchatoula Community History book, the retired principal at Martha Vineyard Elementary School, and teacher at Southeastern, and much more. We're hearing about his life story. We've heard about his childhood, his occupation. What about recreation? What do you do for fun, Mr. Perrin? Obviously, you do a lot of history and research, but what else are you into? What interests do you have aside from those we've discussed?
Well, of course, my family. I enjoy being with my family. I have 2 daughters and 7 grandchildren.
Wow.
I'm very active with the grandchildren. And
they'll keep you busy. What are the age ranges of your grandchildren?
31 to 8.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Nice broad group. Well, my family, my parents have been putting us up. We just slept in our house for the first time last night because we just got electricity back, and we were staying with my mom and dad, who are great grandparents like you. They have a ton of grandkids that, go from, old enough to be school teachers and police officers down to my little preschoolers. But, the time that my little 3 and 5-year-olds spent running and bouncing off their walls really wore them out. I swung by yesterday to check on mom and dad, and at 6:24 p.m., my mom was in bed and asleep. So I know these grandkids can wear you out. And we actually filmed today on Wednesday instead of a Thursday because you're such an active grandparent. You had I think a grandkid scheduling conflict for tomorrow. So that's neat. What else would you like to share with our viewers, Mr. Perrin? Is there anything else on your mind, on your heart? What do you think folks would like to know?
My heart is with the community during this hard time. There's so many people that have suffered. I just had minor damage at my house, but in my subdivision, there were quite a few houses that suffered severe damage. And, being without electricity is the least of the worry.
Yeah, of course.
And one of the things I love about Ponchatoula, I love a lot of things about Ponchatoula, but one of the things is that this is a community, and it pulls together in time of need, whether it's Hurricane Betsy that I remember in 1955, or Katrina in 2005, or this storm. People come together to help each other, to provide food, to provide services, to rescue people when they need rescuing. When we had some school fires here, we had 2 within a space of a year or 2. The community got together to furnish supplies for the teachers and students that had lost items in the fire. It's that kind of community camaraderie that really makes Ponchatoula special to me.
You're so right. It brings to mind my little neighborhood experience, and mine, like yours, is similar in that my family was spared. Our house, the worst of it was some trees in the yard and lack of power for a few weeks. But my neighbors, of course, were not. And we live on South 8th Street. And we've been talking historical homes and structures here in this building. And right across the street from me is one of the most historic buildings in town, the old Pearson House, which you probably know 10 times more about than I do, even though I'm, a few hundred feet away. But that house just really got shellacked. I mean, old growth timber, and the Pearsons have lived there for 4 generations. Bradley Pearson, who now lives immediately out this window behind me, was the 4th generation of Pearson to grow up there. And I'm talking to his dad, Alan, and the chimneys, the brick chimneys, just snapped in half, and trees have hit everything. And that family they're so resilient. Alan and Jean Marie are just working their butt off all day long. But it's the neighborhood coming together, helping one another. I live in the old Sellers house across the street, and next door to me, Cullen Sellers, whose grandfather built the place and who lived there a while. He's over there getting, feeding the energy line crews every night and trying to make sure not just himself, but everybody got power. And even though he got power maybe a week or two before me, he's seeing it through to make sure they take care of us too. I mean, we just have, as you allude to, great people here, and they look out for the whole community. It's just, it takes a village, and we've got such a neighborly, kind of, lean here. People just seem to really care. And that's neat. And I don't think you see that everywhere. I haven't seen it in other places I've lived. What are some lessons you've learned about Ponchatoula as you study this? You mentioned prior storms. I think you mentioned Betsy, Katrina, now Ida. I'm sure there were other storms that came before those, but what have you learned about the resiliency of the community, and what are maybe some lessons that today's young folks that didn't look at microfilm or may never read your book could benefit for if they're just watching this here for a few minutes?
Well, one of the things, and just reading the newspapers from the 1920s, starting in 1921, the town prospering in the 1920s, but going through some really hard times in the 1930s. People that really remember the Depression, there are not many of those left. But if the current generation talks to anybody that lived during the Depression, they know how hard those times were. And again, people helped each other back then, but it was still very hard times. A lot of people lost their homes because they couldn't pay the taxes. The town of Ponchatoula really didn't want to foreclose on anybody because of taxes, but sometimes that happened. This town of Ponchatoula was just about out of money because taxes weren't being paid, and the Ponchatoula town treasury was just about empty. But people got through that only to be involved in World War II. And we talked about the scrap drives. One of the other things that was nice about Ponchatoula was that it was a giving community. There were war bond drives, several of them during World War II. And the people of the Ponchatoula community oversubscribed. They had a quota they were supposed to meet, and Ponchatoula always exceeded that quota. Beyond that, the Ponchatoula men and some women stepped forward and volunteered and served in the armed forces, and a number of them died during the war. So I tend to think that Ponchatoula had more people that volunteered and served in the war for its size than a lot of other communities in the United States. That's
impressive. Yeah. Wow. What do you think are some of the most striking changes you see? You mentioned 1920s and the hard times of the 30s, but if we just go back 100 years, and of course, feel free to go back farther, but what are some of the striking differences you see between the Ponchatoula you've studied and written about in history books and the Ponchatoula you live in today?
Well, about 100 years ago, in 1920, Ponchatoula was a very small town, and the streets were not paved. Most of the blocks of the town were still vacant, without homes. There were no city services in 1920. We didn't have a fire department. We didn't have city water, city sewage. So it was just a small town, a nice town, but again, a
Hmm.
small town. And then, of course, the two lumber mills started on the southern edge of Ponchatoula, the Rathbun Mill and the Williams Mill, two separate companies who had mills next to each other. They shared some services like a water tower on Tower Road, but they were two separate companies. When they came, hundreds of workers came to Ponchatoula, and the whole community changed.
Hmm.
The population of the town quadrupled with those new people moving in and new businesses. The tax revenues increased, and Ponchatoula was able to have some paved streets, a water system, a sewer system. The Ponchatoula Fire Department began in 1921. New municipal building was built in about 1927. So the town really became a small city, not officially, but a small city after 1921, a very prosperous city.
Yeah. So the fire
Unfortunately,
department's about to turn 100. We were just talking about the joiners and that legacy of fire chiefs and captains, and here we are on the centennial year. Wow. So you mentioned the lumber industry. If you don't mind, a quick aside, just to make sure my head's right about this. It seems like we've had kind of two primary agricultural industries here, one being timber or lumber, one being strawberries. But what I'm hearing is the lumber industry or the timber industry came first, right? What's the timeline on that and strawberries and kind of the heyday of each?
well, certainly the lumber industry came first. When James
Hmm.
Clark started the town of Ponchatoula in 1854, he and his brother-in-law set up a lumber mill right across the street from your office in that square block.
Okay.
And had a lumber mill in that square and then in the next square further north for the next 100 years with different people operating the mill. The last big mill was the Vineyard Mill. Mr. Ed Vineyard had a very large mill, plating mill, and a box factory. But the lumber industry, even before those two cypress mills came, was very important to Ponchatoula.
Okay. What about strawberries? When did that kind of come along, and what was the heyday of the strawberry industry?
Well, they grew strawberries in the Ponchatoula area, a few people after the war between the states, the Civil War, but it was just a very small scale growth. Then in the 1890s, they developed a new variety of strawberry plants called the Klondike strawberry plant, and that revolutionized the industry. The Klondike was a hardy strawberry that shipped well, had nice big fruit, and so in the 1890s, and particularly in the opening years of the 20th century, the strawberry industry became more and more important to Ponchatoula. It was something that farmers could grow as a cash crop. They also grew corn and vegetables for their own use, but they could grow strawberries and bring the strawberries into town to their brokerage firm, sell the strawberries and get cash money. It was a wonderful time in Ponchatoula on Saturdays for generations. Farmers
Right.
would come in, their pickers would be paid, and the farmers would be paid on Saturday, and they would bring the family in. The parents could go shopping, the kids could go to the
So
ID.
those saloons you showed us in the old photos probably did pretty well come Saturday night with the economy you're describing.
The sidewalks were jammed in Ponchatoula. You could go to the movie theater for 13 cents and go in and watch a movie picture, a motion picture. If you liked it,
Wow.
you could watch it 2 or 3 times. They had a serial, they had a cartoon, they had a news feature. And for just a little bit of money, you could have a really good time. It was also something for the parents to have kids do while they went shopping. So it worked out well for everybody, merchants, farmers, and everybody else. The farmers in Ponchatoula also had to grow other things besides strawberries, because if you had a bad year for the strawberry crop, you wouldn't have much money coming
Right.
in. Ponchatoula was also a leading center for the produce business, truck farming, different kinds of vegetables, peppers, peas, eggplants, things of that nature. Ponchatoula shipped vast quantities of vegetables from our location.
Hmm.
At one time, Ponchatoula was classed as the second most productive agricultural county in the United States.
Wow. That's
So
shocking. That's amazing.
one of the
Well, another,
one of the
please go
reasons
ahead.
Ponchatoula strawberries did so well, our strawberries could be harvested early in the season, and we would beat most other areas of the country to the market. So Ponchatoula strawberries got a premium price for coming in early. Most of them were shipped to Chicago by rail, but they went all over the country.
Wow. Another question I get a lot, and I'm sure I butcher the answer, is the one about the name, the history with the Choctaw and the flowing hair. Can you tell us about the root of the Ponchatoula name and kind of the truth behind the myth?
Well, Indians lived in the Ponchatoula area for thousands of years, but the last tribe to live in this area were the Choctaws. And from the Choctaws, we get the names of a lot of different streams and localities. Ponchatoula is said to be a Choctaw word referring to hanging hair. And there's a couple theories behind what that really meant. But the nicest one is that it was referring to the Spanish moss, which hangs from many of the trees, particularly the oak trees. The French called it Spanish moss. The Spanish called it Frenchman's beard. Ponchatoula is said to refer to hanging hair. There's a more gruesome story that it was somebody's head that was cut off and it was
Oh, wow.
hanging by their hair. I tend to want to talk about the moss story.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we should go with that. We'll get Faith Allen and all the local marketing folks to come in here and back us up, but we can probably sell more berries with a flowing hair story.
And Tangipahoa, another Choctaw word, is said to refer to corn gatherers.
Okay. Neat. That's neat. Well, what other interesting Ponchatoula tidbits would you like to share? We've got a few more minutes here, and you've been so generous with your time, and we're very grateful for it. But what else would you like to share before you go?
Well, of course, I've always been interested in the school system, and our school system started off very small scale with one-room schools around in the rural areas and very small schools in town. We had a segregated system for generations with a small school for black African American children, and a small, but a little bit larger school for white children. And that continued until 1969. But the Ponchatoula school system for all children progressed over the years, with the schools getting larger in the buildings and larger enrollments, better facilities generally. So the schools have progressed quite a bit, and I'm always very proud of being a Ponchatoula High School graduate.
Me too.
They didn't have graduation from any of the other Ponchatoula schools, so even though I finished junior high, there wasn't a graduation for that. But I remember in 1964, when I graduated, we had a new principal, A.J. Bodker.
What a legend.
Mr. Will Ed Butler had been the principal of the Ponchatoula schools for a generation, and he was our principal for a number of years. But Mr. Bodker started in 1963, and I graduated in 64, and we were his first class of graduating seniors. And of course, that same building that was built in the 1920s is now the junior high school. I'm so happy that they were able to renovate and save that building. It's a nice building.
It's beautiful. It's just a wonderful structure. It's really gorgeous.
And of course, we have the new high school.
And didn't Mr. Bacher build the new high school when he was principal?
Mr. Bacher was the principal when that school was built. He was instrumental in having it built and designed.
We really had some great principals. I was fortunate to be in the last class Mr. Allen had, and before and after, we've had some great educators, and you're certainly one of them. It's great to have you on the show. We have a question here from Whitney Robichaud, who asked about the lumber industry paid in mill money that was only good at a mill store. Do you know anything about that? Could you tell us about the mill store here in Ponchatoula?
Right. Some of the lumber mills issued not coins, but tokens and other forms of money that you had to use in their store. You couldn't go to a store in Ponchatoula and use it. You had to use it at the company store. And the mills also had their own residential communities. Each mill had their own community, generally called Millville, but each had a special name. And they had a physician that worked at the mill. I can remember Dr. Scott. When I was a young man, we had two Dr. Scotts, one in the town of Ponchatoula and the other at the mill. So we called him Dr. Scott at the mill. I don't remember his first name, but I went to Dr. Scott at the mill when I had a problem. Those houses in Millville were built of cypress lumber, and many of them are still in existence. And sometimes when they're being torn down, people vie for that wood because that was very valuable cypress lumber. But those tokens were used in the company store. And there were other businesses like the Edwards store also issued tokens.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, Mr. Whitney, thank you for asking that question. That's an interesting piece of our history, and you're in the right spot. We've got the man who knows the answers. Folks, we've almost reached the end of our hour here. And so with that, I want to thank those of you watching for viewing. It's always a pleasure to have the Ponchatoula Live show here for you. And Mr. Perrin, I'll let you part with the final words. Is there anything you'd like to share with our viewers before we go?
Well, I'd just like to express my love for the community. And Ponchatoula is a changing community. We have a lot of new people moving in, and I love new people. The traffic, not so much, but I love all the new people moving in.
Right.
Ponchatoula is going to continue to progress. It's going to be a great community for generations yet to come.
Well, thank you so much for doing your part in the community and help us, keep the history of the community. Folks, we'll see you back here next week at the Ponchatoula Live show. Thank you for tuning in. And once again, we thank Mr. Jim Perrin for being with us.